Hello, everyone. We are really blessed to have a great business owner here with us today to talk about COVID-19 and the work that his company's been doing in the area of medication and study. So, Tim Schroeder, CEO of CTI, Clinical Trials here in Covington. You've got hundreds of employees really across the world. But I'm going to jump right in, Tim, and say thank you for doing this. And B, tell us about the company and what you typically do in the world of trials and medications.
Well, first of all, Kris, thanks for having me. As you mentioned, CTI is a company that we formed more than 20 years ago. And over the couple decades, we've expanded to be a global company with associates in about 40 countries. We work typically on behalf of about 200 pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and medical device companies. And we basically become their research arm. They will arm us with information about their products, and then we will frequently go to the FDA, negotiate what does it look like to treat the first patients with a new drug. And then once we get into that particular stage or phase, we start then going, okay, what is the process and how long and what data do you need to get this drug ultimately approved? And in our 20 plus years, we've been part of about 110 drug approvals across FDA and other agencies in Europe and Latin America and Asia Pacific. Historically, the company has always focused on hospitalized, critically ill patient populations. So typical for us has been doing research in the cancer field, doing research in the transplantation field, doing research in the rare disease area. And of late, we've been doing a lot of cell and gene therapy research where rather than treating diseases, we're actually looking to cure them. And, despite the current environment, all of those research projects continue. So that's one of the current challenges is if you have a patient or series of patients in a cancer trial, and maybe they started the study 6 months or a year or even 5 years ago, many times we follow these patients for a decade or longer, and we have to keep supplying them medication. We have to make sure that they continue to get the diagnostic test. Maybe it's a CT scan to show whether the drug's working or not, things like that. So part of our world has been around just keeping more than 100 active research studies going, as we say, keeping the balls in the air, keeping those progressing. And then, of course, the whole COVID-19 world, which started hitting CTI in Asia in January, and then in Europe in February, and then in North America and South America, for the last, say, 60 days or so.
So the time frame, normal world of what you do is months, years, a decade or so. How does that compare to the effort now that you all are seeing among all the drug companies and you're all going after this with COVID-19? How does that look differently today?
Yeah, typically, Kris, what you see is, as you described it, a staged approach where companies start doing research in the laboratory. Frequently, there are animal testing that's being done. And then over several years, you move into humans, and frequently we'll start with healthy volunteers at very low doses, and then gradually move into the population that we're interested in testing. And you described it right. It's many years, sometimes 3 to 5 to 7 years before we treat the first patient, and then it might be another half dozen years before we get finished with those studies and get a drug approved. What we've seen in the COVID-19 landscape is just like we've seen unprecedented things happening everywhere else, we've seen it in the research setting as well. So our interactions with FDA and their counterparts around the world, many times those reviews will take us a month or longer. We're actually seeing those reviews sometimes in 72 hours or less.
Wow.
I can speak personally that I have been on calls with FDA reviewers at night, on the weekends, incredibly dedicated groups, and it's across multiple divisions at the FDA. And then similarly, if you consider research hospitals, is they have their own processes to review studies and decide are they safe for their patients. We have to negotiate contracts and budgets, and we have to train the staff. Well, instead of those things taking weeks and months, we're doing those in days. And then the last part of it, just to add an extra level of complexity, is normally our staff goes on site and we're actually at the research hospitals. And we are training the team how to conduct the study. And then we're the oversight mechanism that we have several hundred people that travel every day to research hospitals. Well, obviously that's not happening here in the United States. It's not happening anywhere in the world to speak of. And so we're having to do all that remotely. So it's fascinating to see how the processes have been shortened. I would not say anybody's taking shortcuts, but I think they're being very thoughtful in the use of technology. They're being very thoughtful in what can they do to protect the healthcare workers and not expose them to patients unnecessarily. But it's really been unprecedented. You know, we've got a few of our projects, and we have about a dozen active projects now with different treatments at different stages of COVID-19 infected patients. And we have seen some of these move as quickly as first conversation with the FDA to treating the first patient in a month or less. And normally that would be at least a year and might be 2 or 3 years sometimes to get to that stage.
Wow. And so with this process, you've got your partner companies who you're doing these trials, trying to obviously with totally new models. Is there a sense that of understanding this disease being different than anything else, or is it just the fact that with enough time and enough effort, we're going to get to a point where there are vaccines and there are drugs that can be treated to really treat the sick as well as keep people from becoming sick?
Well, I think you described it really well, Chris. At this point in time, and it's fascinating because almost every day amongst our team, and I would say we probably now have a couple hundred people working specifically on COVID-19 projects at CTI. But in a typical day, many of us are in conversations with both the regulatory authorities as well as the physicians, the nurses, and pharmacists treating these patients. And the thing that we've seen evolve over the last maybe 8 weeks or so is I specifically remember a conversation with, and we set these calls up to get feedback and to provide feedback. But I remember about 2.5 weeks ago, I was on a call with somebody in Southern California, and I started off by saying, just, thanks for being here. How's your day going? And they said, we're having a great day. And I said, really? That's terrific. What made today special? And they said, we discharged the first patient who was in the intensive care unit on a ventilator. Now, like I said, that was just a few weeks ago. I think what we're hearing and seeing firsthand now is maybe as many as 80% of the patients coming into the intensive care units are being able to be stabilized, ultimately get off of ventilators, and hopefully move towards being either discharged or get into rehab facilities. So I think even at the research hospital level, we're arming them with, they have more knowledge than they had before. They're sharing the knowledge among themselves on a phenomenal real-time level. And then they have access to some of these investigational agents that they did not have. And I think all those things coupled with, as you described it, we've got a really, really nasty virus that we didn't know a lot about, a few months ago, that each day we learn more and basically take today's knowledge, incorporate it into both the research and the real-time treatment. And ultimately the beneficiaries obviously are people, who unfortunately contract this virus.
You're an expert. You've got your undergrad was biology, right? Was that correct?
It was, yes, many, many years ago.
And then you had teaching history. You're a businessman. You have a big team. You've got a unique perspective, right? So corporate, you've got science. When you look at this, is this going to be a long-term coming out of it in terms of getting to the point of normal? Or is it a case where someone's going to come up with you're going to have great results in a week or two that it suddenly allows us to all say, well, great, we're going to pop a pill and have a vaccine and be good to go. Which is more likely to be the case in your mind?
I think the short answer to it, Chris, is we don't know. But I think the speculation is, I'm an optimistic person by definition, but I hedge that optimism with facts, science facts. Like you said, I consider myself a scientist more than a business person. There are more than 50 companies developing a vaccine right now. And I am optimistic that a year from now, we will not have just one vaccine. I think we'll have multiple vaccines. Keep in mind, if you think about the influenza vaccine, each year, the influenza vaccine, that virus mutates each year and the vaccine changes. And one of the things about that virus is it goes from the northern hemisphere in the winter to the southern hemisphere in their winter, our summer. And then we make a new vaccine based on a lot on their results from that previous 6 months or so. And so as a research entity, CTI does do vaccine work, and we do influenza work, but they will frequently come to us in the end of the summer and basically say, we need you to test this year's vaccine. And then they choose based on which ones look most effective, which ones they will then scale up and manufacture. Now, the good news is the large pharmaceutical companies are very adept at developing and manufacturing vaccines in millions of doses in very short periods of time and having those out at Kroger's or Walgreens or at your local physician. So I think the first question is, which vaccine is going to be successful and how quickly will we know that? I think that's probably 6 months off before we get to that stage. So that's when I think when that happens, we're probably in a better position to say, can we vaccinate the entire population, or at least people at most risk? And then I think, there's certainly a chance do we return completely to normal or whatever the new normal is. I think the interim period, over the next, say, 3 to 6 months, the more we learn and have testing available, and it's not just the active testing that's being done right now to say you are infected, but the information of have you previously been infected, and has your immune system developed an antibody that might protect you? As that testing becomes more prevalent, I think that will allow us, certainly from a business perspective, to decide, how do we open businesses up? How do we open up social gatherings and things like that?
We've got a sense today that we want to have some hope. Give us some hope about what the options look like moving forward. Are you seeing things that are moving in a positive way?
Yeah, I think in general, and I think one of the things in the U.S. is we tend to be U.S. centric for multiple reasons, but I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned in Asia and in Europe. And I think one of the things we're starting to see in those two jurisdictions especially is we're seeing, dampening of new cases. We're seeing less hospitalizations, less deaths. We're seeing some businesses start to open in very controlled ways. So I would argue, one thing we need to do is learn from them. I think the other thing we need to consider is the U.S. as a country, is almost as large as the entire continent of Europe. And so in some ways, probably one lesson doesn't fit all here. And I know that's going to be hard for people to take. And from a CTI perspective, we have about 10 offices across North America. We have associates, I think, in about 36 states. So it's, we're a very small, portion of this, but I can sympathize, with people like yourself who are trying to make policy, as well as businesses who are trying to recover or stay alive. But I don't think it's a one size fits all answer, for things that maybe some of us are looking for.
That's a great way of understanding. We are a big country where we have a lot of people with different levels of this virus in dealing with our community. So, well, as we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with the community that you really think that people need to know about COVID-19 and what's happening behind the scenes to improve the health of our country and our community?
Well, I guess maybe two parts to that answer. Number one, I would say is there's some great stuff going on here in the region that we don't always appreciate. You've heard me say this before on other matters, but I think one of our biggest challenges in this part of the country is we're very humble. If the work we were doing in the region on anything, took place on the coast, I think it would be trumpeted, to much louder, levels. Great things going on at our hospitals and our medical centers. We have studies with most of the systems here, and I, talking firsthand with executives and with folks that are doing this type of work. They are making advances in their treatments, day to day. So I think we're seeing patients in our community get better outcomes than they would have even just a few weeks ago. We're seeing support companies, at the highest levels, the Procter and Gambles and the Krogers of the world, that are literally feeding us, literally and figuratively, through the pandemic and providing supplies. And then we've got some of the smaller companies, Meridian Diagnostics in Newtown. They're developing and creating the reagents that go into this COVID-19 testing. You got somebody like Gravity Diagnostics right here in Covington, who is doing thousands and thousands of tests. That was not their specialty just a couple months ago. So I think we've seen tremendous resolve in the business community and rallying around this. I think beyond that, the second part to your answer to your question, I would say is about the hope factor. And like I said, I'm very confident that we will have a vaccine a year from now. I'm also equally confident that the treatments that are becoming available and we're becoming knowledge about are going to improve the outcomes in the meantime. So hopefully we can decrease the exposure and at the same time decrease the morbidity and mortality in people who do get this. And I think we're seeing evidence of it. And I have to say, looking at the daily statistics, sometimes you can either become overwhelmed or numb by it. And, I think all of the, various jurisdictions are trying to do their best on the reporting, but I don't think that necessarily, that reporting lags in a lot of cases what's really happening. So I think the message would be there's a lot more positivity than maybe we're recognizing right now at this point in time.
Well, I'm going to end on that because that's what we want. The great work you guys are doing, we appreciate it. We know your team's working, burning the midnight oil every day. We appreciate all the work they're doing with the rest of the healthcare community and the rest of the heroes, I would call them, in our area. So thank you so much, Tim.
My pleasure. Thank you, Kris. And I agree. I was going to say I should have earlier given a shout out to our team because, to your point, many of them are working 16, 18 hours a day at frantic paces and doing great stuff. So I appreciate you recognizing that.
You bet. Thanks.